Yeah, I mean, it's still psilocybin. I mean, it's psilocybin, the same psilocybin that's in the mushroom. It's just a purified form of a crystalline type of psilocybin, and other modifications. They take the normal hydrogen and they add another proton to it, and now you have a very minor kind of atomic level variation, but it does affect the metabolism in a certain way and may make the time course in the body a little bit different, generally a little bit longer. And so some companies have filed deuterated versions of drugs because they do provide protection.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast, an official podcast for the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention. Today, we're excited to have Mr. Graham Pechenik as our guest in today's episode. Graham is a registered patent attorney and the founder of Calyx Law, a law firm specializing in intellectual property for the cannabis and psychedelic industries. With degrees in Cognitive Neuroscience and Biochemistry from UC San Diego and a JD from New York University, Graham has a wealth of experience in various industries, including pharmaceuticals, biotech, and technology. In 2016, he founded Calyx Law to assist cannabis and psychedelic ventures in developing their IP strategies. Graham is also the editor-at-large of Psychedelic Alpha, founding steward of the IP Committee of the Psychedelic Bar Association, and a member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. Join us as we dive into an insightful conversation with Graham Pechenik and the various workshops that he will be involved with at the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention. Please welcome Mr. Graham Pechenik to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. Hey, I am here with Graham Pechenik. We're an official podcast for the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention, and I'm really so excited that you're here because you're going to be speaking at the convention. You've got two sessions, one on the 20th, one on the 23rd. I hope we can jump into that. But I was wondering if we can kind of start with like a little overview about your background and how you became involved with the legal aspects of cannabis and psychedelics, because you've got you're in like at the forefront, you're at the leading edge, and I'm just interested, how'd you get here?
Yeah, well, I feel fortunate every day to realize that I am at the forefront of the space, and obviously the space itself is at the forefront of so much else in our culture. So I think we can all be fortunate, or hopefully feel so, for being involved in it and for taking, some people, the risk to align themselves with psychedelics when there's still some stigma, even though it's disappearing. For me, I've followed an interest that's been long held in psychedelics and cannabis. I was interested in them since high school and college, and thought for a little while I would actually be someone who would make new psychedelic compounds after I learned about Sasha Shulgin, reading his books when I was in college. And then realized it would be difficult to, or at least I was told it would be difficult to be a scientist at the time I was in college, to go to grad school to do something in psychopharmacology or chemistry having to do with psychedelics, but had still enough interest in them that I thought I could do some drug policy reform or something else involving cannabis and psychedelics, and went to law school. And then somewhat quickly realized that it was a bit naive to think I could do that, especially paying my way through law school, and didn't find a match there. But with my science background, was very heavily recruited into patent law, and that was, I suppose, the easy path. So followed that and spent the start of my career close to a decade doing patent work. And so writing patents, being involved in cases where we were litigating either against patents or defending our own patents. And then in 2016, cannabis passed in California and became legal for adult use. And at that time, there were a number of companies with people that I knew who were trying to start businesses, either new businesses, or they were already doing work with cannabis with legacy businesses that they wanted to bring above ground. And because I was sort of one of the lawyers in my friend group, tried to make sense of some of the cannabis-related, new laws for people and what they could do, even though that wasn't my specialty. But then when I started going to some cannabis business conferences, noticed that a lot of people were doing things which were actually patentable, and many of them recognized they were patentable. Some of them didn't. But in speaking to most of them, I learned that it was hard for a lot of people who wanted to seek patents to find a big law firm who would do patent work with a cannabis company, even if they weren't a plant-touching cannabis company, because law firms are sort of risk-averse and stodgy, and the national ones weren't really interested in kind of sticking their necks out. And at the same time, I was in a lot of conversations and heard a lot of people talk about, even when the word patent was raised to them, that they were anxious about what patents would mean, and they were concerned about what would happen if somebody filed patents, and would that be a way for big ag or big tobacco or just generally the monopolization of the cannabis industry kind of before it got off the ground, and would keep the small businesses from being able to pursue potential success in the cannabis space. And so I thought that it would be a really interesting just area to work in, both because I had continued to be following the kind of development of the space and interested in cannabis culture, and as I said, kind of had friends in the kind of cannabis space, and then also thinking about those controversies. What would it mean to file patents? Saw that kind of working with that tension was something that would be just an interesting and hopefully a way to have a business in the cannabis space, but a way to be thinking about those broader, bigger picture items in a way that was challenging and interesting. And I guess so. I've gotten to cannabis, and so I did that from 2016 to about 2019. In 2019, I realized that there were a number of companies in the psychedelic space that were similar to many of the companies in the kind of early days of cannabis patents, filing a bunch of applications, particularly around psilocybin in the beginning. And the same kind of conversations were coming up around, what did this mean for the evolution of the psychedelics ecosystem? Would this mean that the space would develop towards purely a medical or pharmaceutical model? What would it mean for the people in the underground who are providing psychedelic assisted therapy if they wanted to eventually, in a legalized market, provide those same services? Would they have to worry about infringing some big company's patents? Would it mean that a big company could monopolize aspects of psychedelic therapy or psychedelic compounds? And so sort of following the same interests, I guess, in the legal perspective, and some of those, the same desire to stay part of that conversation around the controversies, and then just continuing to be really interested in psychedelics and continuing to be trying to be in the kind of cultural space. I mean, living in San Francisco and, interested in being part of psychedelics related communities and having psychedelics be a part of my kind of personal and social life too, just made it sort of a natural fit to get there. So I guess that's maybe not the crispest short answer, but that's kind of how I ended up with a firm doing patent law in psychedelics.
It's so weird for me, Graham, because I'm like an old hippie, and I went through the whole 60s and the whole Nixon era and the suppression and all of that, and we start to see through the Reagan era that just say no and all that, and now here we are, and from a societal viewpoint, from a fundamental viewpoint, we're looking at companies that are not only filing patents but are looking for protection along that way. So you've experienced, you've had a very impressive career, some high profile clients. Tell me about the patent area, and specifically how it applies. What patents? Are we talking about genetics in cannabis? Are we talking like Monsanto? There's a specific genetic propensity? Are we talking about like compass pathways where you are patenting a combination of, psychedelics, and then you're looking at a process, like, just the process of wearing eye shades, for example? I mean,
Hmm.
what is it that people are trying to patent, and why is that so important at this particular point in terms of the um, um, acceptability, if you will, the mainstreaming of cannabis as well as psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what are people patenting, it's almost like if you can think of it, somebody has filed a patent application on it. And many of these aren't successful patent applications because the thing has to be novel and non-obvious and inventive for it to be granted a patent. But there has been this sort of gold rush mentality in cannabis with many thousands, maybe tens of thousands now patent applications filed, and similarly in psychedelics. I would say generally in psychedelics, the sort of first wave of patent applications that were filed were generally on known compounds, like psilocybin, just on the different methods that they could be used. So, how to treat a different uh, set of patients with a particular indication with that compound. So,
Mhm.
almost anything you can think of for psilocybin probably has been filed. The method of using psilocybin for
Mhm.
name the condition. Then there's maybe a second category that was
Mhm.
around the same time filed as the first, but as companies started to realize they needed stronger IP on the compounds themselves to raise money for their drug development, modified versions of the known drugs. And so, because something has to be novel and non-obvious to be patented, psilocybin itself, as the compound or LSD or MDMA, can't be patented.
Mhm.
But you can find ways to file patents on a type of that drug or a small modification of that drug. So, I mean, you
Mhm.
mentioned Compass, probably a lot of people will have heard of, and these were the first patent applications that published in the space, really, were compasses on a crystalline polymorph of
Mhm.
a specific type of uh, psilocybin.
Mhm.
Um,
And it's a
and
small minor change, right? I mean, it's not like a huge structural
yeah, I
change,
mean,
but enough to go ahead and get a
it's
patent.
still psilocybin. I mean, it's psilocybin, the same psilocybin that's in the mushroom. It's
Right.
just a purified form of a crystalline
Mhm.
type of psilocybin. Um, and other modifications, like a number of companies have deuterated drugs, which just means they take the normal hydrogen and they add another proton to it, and now you have a very minor kind of atomic level
Mhm.
variation, but it does affect the metabolism in a certain way and may make the time course in the body a little bit different, generally a little bit longer. And so some companies have filed deuterated versions of drugs because they do provide protection.
Mhm.
Um, and sort of that set also takes advantage of the fact that with the regulatory requirements,
Mhm.
those types of drugs can generally rely on some of the regulatory data, the preclinical data, and even
Mhm.
sometimes some of the clinical data with the unmodified drugs. So if you have deuterated DMT or deuterated psilocybin,
Mhm.
you can sort of piggyback on some of the known safety data, some of the already published clinical research to be able to accelerate your development.
Mhm.
And so you get a little bit better IP protection
Mhm.
and maybe a little bit of a lag compared to just trying to get MDMA or psilocybin through FDA as
Mhm.
MAPS and Compass are doing. But you can just kind of strike a balance. A number of the other patent applications filed, and this is a
Mhm.
big category, and this is most of the work that we do, is with wholly novel compounds. So these are compounds that have
Mhm.
generally never been uh, and presumably because they have to be novel to be protectable, have
Mhm.
never been made before or tested before or
Mhm.
used before in humans. And so these will have the whole development pathway ahead of them. They'll have to go through safety and toxicity and put through all three phases of clinical trials. And
Mhm.
so maybe many years before they're if they're shown to be safe and effective in clinical trials before they're approved by the FDA and commercialized. And of course, that goal of finally getting a new drug to the clinic and to patients is the reason that patents, kind of serve a purpose in the pharmaceutical space. It's because, if there wasn't protection, or there is something else, that we could talk about with data protection, which like MAPS is trying to use, as it would provide 5 years before a generic could launch. But putting aside that type of regulatory exclusivity, without the patent exclusivity, a generic could launch a competing drug, and by having a competing drug on the market, the original drug manufacturer, knowing that, wouldn't have the incentive initially to invest all the hundreds of millions of dollars it might cost to take a drug through development. And so patents provide the ability to recoup those expenses, and therefore attract the investment to bring drugs to market to begin with. So at least that's the argument for why we have patents.
Right. I mean, and at the MAPS Psychedelic Science Convention, we're going to have like literally everyone, on both sides of the aisle, the establishment, right, and then the anti-establishment there, and there is this whole tension between those who take entheogens and go ahead and take out the roots of them and then turn them into like Monsanto, turn them into these these super drugs that are supposed to be better and or configured in a way that really allows them to manage them or control them and the process around them. And I'm just because you talked about earlier your science background. You've got you changed. You had from what I understand, looking at your bio, you had your first experience with psychedelics inspired you to choose your choice of science majors. And I'm just wondering, as you look at your background there and you look at your experience and you look at what's happening in the marketplace, where do you see this tension going between the establishment and the anti-establishment? Do you think there's enough room in the tent for all of them?
I mean, I certainly hope so. And, I think this is one of the biggest questions just about the space is where it'll be in 5 years or 20 years.
Right.
Somebody once called me an optimistic pluralist, and I've kind of held on to that definition because I think it was a really good one. But I do like to think that, a rising tide
lifts all boats.
The sort of mainstreaming, that being the tide will lift all boats, and there's not going to be any form of conflict that prevents one way of people approaching psychedelics and the way that they would find preferable from being either allowed or easily accessible.
Right.
So one of the controversies is around patents, and one of the ones that has certainly attracted me to be critical with patents potentially has been, were pharmaceutical companies to file patents on the ways of using psychedelics, would those be used against practitioners in legal markets like in Oregon or in Colorado? Would those be used in a way that they spread beyond the kind of protection of the pharmaceutical version of a psychedelic to other forms of contact with psychedelics? I mean, I think there have been some warning signs there, and going back to cannabis, there's stories about when GW Pharma was seeking approval for Epidiolex, which is just CBD. They had lobbyists who were trying to keep CBD and other cannabis-based products from being easily accessible on dispensary shelves, since presumably would cut into their market. So certainly I think there are reasons to be concerned potentially about the companies who are seeking FDA approval from potentially standing in the way of legalization efforts at state levels, or seeking to stand in the way of other access to psychedelics that would minimize the market, so to speak, for people who want to be able to seek the benefits of psychedelics. But hopefully there is space for everybody, and I do think that there are, and certainly many people I believe would agree with this, that there are many people who would prefer to have access to psychedelics through one particular way or another. I mean, I think my parents, for example, would be much more likely to want a prescription from
Hmm.
a doctor and, see somebody in a more, um, established kind of clinical environment for their
Hmm.
first, psychedelic experiences, or their friends might, rather than going to um, an ayahuasca ceremony,
Hmm.
or
Right.
going to
A
an
rave or
underground
something like
practitioner.
that.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
going to a rave, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I think that, that I always go back to the Maslow hierarchy of needs, and this whole
Hmm.
idea of self-actualization or transformation, and, the ability to kind of get there, and how psychedelics really do help from a pathway viewpoint, for people to at least start to look at their lives and, kind of make sense of the stories or the narratives around their lives. I said before, in your bio, you mentioned your experiences. Has that impacted you in terms of these experience? Has that shaped your personal and professional journey? Are you okay with speaking to that for a moment? Because you have a rare, what did you call yourself? What did people call you? They called you
Oh, an
a
optimistic
pluralist,
pluralist.
an optimistic pluralist. Maybe we can unpack that as well, because that's a very interesting term. So, you're in a position of helping people in a number of areas, whether or not they're personal, practitioners, or corporates that are looking to go ahead and, obviously, with the gold rush, the psychedelic gold rush, help them to go ahead and put their properties in a patent position to go ahead and do that. I'm just wondering, how does this all play with your experiences and your understanding of the marketplace, and how has it tempered your perspective as you go ahead and work with people?
Yeah, I mean that is a really good question. I mean, I think the way that I'm able to remain a pluralist, or be a pluralist, is just because I do have some fairly non-overlapping spheres of
Mm-hmm.
the way I contact psychedelics in kind of my life and my work. I mean, as a patent lawyer, almost all the companies I work with are in drug discovery, that are trying to come up with new drugs that they will patent and then develop through the clinical pathway to FDA approval, and then they would be, prescribable by a psychiatrist or a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
um, for patients who have mental health disorders.
Mm-hmm.
I myself, despite having experience with psychedelics, have never had a psychedelic experience with a psychotherapist, or for specific purposes of dealing with a mental health condition. And so maybe I'm fortunate in that way, but I've generally had psychedelic experiences that one might call recreational, even though I can imagine, certainly, and especially, looking back, they've been therapeutic. But as you mentioned, in the rave context, or, at festivals, or,
Mm-hmm.
just, weekends, camping, or, doing art in a Airbnb with friends, or,
Right.
ways certainly that aren't the types of things that people bringing, patenting and bringing drugs through clinical trials are thinking about. And so I have, deep appreciation for psychedelics being used in those ways. And I haven't been somebody who's spent a lot of time at ayahuasca ceremonies. I mean, I've done some, but I know a lot of lawyers who are colleagues of mine who spend their work with psychedelics, working
Mm-hmm.
with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I mean, I know you just had on Allison Hoots, who's a
Mm-hmm.
a colleague and a friend, and I have great appreciation for that way of being able to access psychedelics as a sacrament, and
Mm-hmm.
in ceremonial forms. And so I certainly do have a concern that there can be a tension in the desire to, say, commercialize psychedelics, how that can impact
Mm-hmm.
the other ways, even if it's not necessarily companies who are seeking to prevent the other types of
Mm-hmm.
access to psychedelics, but maybe just as all these forms start to get more and more mainstreamed. I mean, what is it that we're hearing in the news? What is it we're hearing on the View? Like, what is it that I guess, as a broader culture, are first coming into contact with
Mm-hmm.
when we're, hearing about psychedelics, when we're kind of internalizing this
Mm.
change, this evolution from prohibition to acceptance,
Mhm.
is that acceptance going to be biased towards thinking of these as new pharmaceutical kind of miracle drugs, that kind of replacements to SSRIs or
Mhm.
anti-anxiety drugs or or
Right.
something like that, or are they going to be something that really transforms our culture in some other ways? And
Right.
so um, may have lost the plot a little bit from your question, but
No,
I guess that's kind
I
of
think the
part of being
pluralist
a
aspect,
pluralist is,
yeah, I mean, you're being a
trying to balance
pluralist.
everything at once.
That's great. It's both and I like that because there's enough room in the tent for everybody in your perspective. And certainly I think going back to what you said before is so true. When we start taking a look at the research and the funding and the development and the market for psychedelics, there are certain companies that are funding the marketplace to go ahead and look at legalization and acceptability because you can't just go and have a rave over at the VA. When we start taking a look at the rigor and the requirements to go ahead and follow the rigor and the science that comes out of that based on that research, that's really what's being used. Show me the money, yes, but show me the documentation and the facts, the efficacy rates that show me that this actually works, and show me how you're going to make it safe so that I don't have to worry about somebody freaking out and running across the road and getting hit by a car, God forbid.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think maybe just one more thing to add is I do think these different ways of psychedelics coming into our culture are very complementary too. I mean, I can
Mhm.
see that the medicalization path has been, in a large way, what has allowed mainstream culture to start kind of
Mhm.
lowering what the stigma is for these drugs, because they've been shown to be so successful in treating different conditions, and can see the work that MAPS certainly paved over many decades as being so critical for this.
Right.
But at the same time, if it was just medicalization and not cultural changes, I think just doing psychedelics and all going back to our lives as usual, we just return to the same social structures that,
Right.
in many cases, made the dysfunction there to create mental disorders in the first place. And so, having these as cultural tools rather than just as kind of individual,
Mm-hmm.
health tools, I think is something that's really important.
Yeah, well, what you're talking about to me also talks about agency, having agency, self-agency. And I think part of the challenge, I mean, I'm sure you saw the news in Kentucky, there's 140
Hmm.
billion, 140 million in terms of research using Ibogaine for opioid addiction. I just had a conversation with Andrew Tatarsky yesterday, who's helping to
Hmm.
lead up that area for harm reduction. And we started taking a look at the opportunities for psychedelics to really help with addiction, help with PTSD, help with trauma in all kinds of ways. So, just having that efficacy there and that agency is important. You're an advocate for cognitive liberty. Can you explain what the term means to you and why you think it's essential in the context of psychedelic laws and certainly for individuals? For those people, cognitive liberty is, as I understand it, I had to look it up. It's the right to mental self-determination, is the freedom of an individual to control their own mental process and cognition. And that's big because, that whole area, and certainly in the addiction field, we talk about, addiction is when somebody doesn't have agency, or in this particular case, I would say cognitive liberty to be able to control their
Hmm.
own destiny. They're kind of doing things that they don't want to be doing because they don't have agency over their lives. Tell me your perspective in terms of the laws and how it all plays in because of your advocacy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I should start by saying it's not so much my advocacy that's had any impact in this area. I've not myself been an advocate for it, so to speak, although it's been certainly the seed, I think, that in a large way got me to law school, because thinking that that was a way to stay in contact with the psychedelics
Mhm.
space as a lawyer. I think your definition really set it out well. I mean, if I were to try to summarize what I thought, I guess quickly, I mean, it's
Hmm.
really the right to control one's consciousness, I
Mm.
suppose, and obvious. And I think people who think about cognitive liberty have often set it out as sort of two kind of
Hmm.
different aspects. I mean, so one is a freedom from interference with
Hmm.
your consciousness or your ways of thought, and the other is the freedom to have
Hmm.
your own thought, your own cognitive processes, your own consciousness, and that generally is the area where it interfaces with drug policy or the ability to use drugs. So
Hmm.
uh, if somebody takes psychedelics, I think it goes without saying that has a big impact on your consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, and so the prohibition from being able to take psychedelics or a drug like that is therefore you're restricting one's ability to enter those types of conscious states. Um, and I think part of the question perhaps you asked was sort of how I became interested in this, or what the
Hmm.
kind of impact of it to me was. I mean, I think when I first really started thinking about it was in college and maybe a little bit before in high school when I was perhaps even just trying to justify my own drug use, but also just as kind of a teenager thinking like, well, this is kind of irrational and unfair that there are these laws against this thing that like doesn't harm anybody else, and having sort of a superficial understanding of the kind of classical liberal thought, I guess, that we learn in high school that our country is founded on, the right of liberty when it doesn't impinge on
And
what others.
self-determination. Yeah.
Yeah, self-determination. The right to do what we wish as long as it doesn't impact others, and really seeing the prohibition against drug use as being just so clearly in violation of that in such a way.
Mm.
And so it became, I think, partly because another reason I think I may have wanted to go to law school is I was kind of an argumentative person and thought like maybe I could put my argumentative skills to use to find a way to demonstrate that this was just so clear. It seemed so clear that this was just such an illogical stance for
Mm. Hmm.
um, for the law to take. I mean, I think that reflects also the naivete of a high school or college student thinking you could
Mm.
argue your way out of something that
Hmm.
drug policy reformers have been doing for decades
Right.
unsuccessfully. Um, but so. Uh, yeah, I guess I started thinking about it in college. I was working in the neuroscience lab or in the
Hmm.
cognitive science department. The lab right one over was studying brain computer interfaces.
Hmm.
And one of the things that they were thinking about a lot, and we spent some time thinking about, is the laws that would prohibit enhancements in
Mm. Hmm.
mental capacity. And so cognitive liberty was, thought of from the perspective of being able to use drugs, but also being able to, even enhance our thought and, in
Hmm.
different ways by,
Right,
um,
right, right. So open up the neural connections and have a broader consciousness, if you will. And I think that one of the things that came up for me in this definition was really understanding, like back in the 60s and 70s, it was like people were turning on, tuning in, dropping out, and really kind of blaming the establishment and the man.
mhm,
The man was the problem. The man was the problem. And of course, Nixon's war on drugs and Reagan's war on drugs really was to go ahead and sweep that clean in a number of areas because that was threatening. And it seems to me that there is some concern around that opportunity, certainly if not from a governmental viewpoint, which is why the legislation is so important, but also from even the psychiatric community. I mean, when people have cognitive liberty, why do they need
mhm,
a psychiatrist? If they feel good about who they are and they feel in connection with the world, why do I need an SSRI? Why do I need the pharmaceutical industry? There's a lot of kind of backlash. We had the same thing happen with cannabis back in reefer madness days when, we were looking at Reynolds Company and we were looking at, the ability to use cannabis to go ahead and replace, 1 acre of cannabis versus acres of trees. The
Hmm.
real opportunity there. So it's a real interesting perspective and a real interesting insight. I don't know how we're going to unpack that in the
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I don't know how it's operationalized, and I'm not the expert. I would recommend people read Charlotte Walsh has written a lot of articles on cognitive liberty, in particular on cognitive liberty and psychedelics, that can lay things out much more than I can by trying
Charlotte
to
Walsh.
remember. Charlotte
Charlotte.
Walsh,
Okay. Hmm.
yeah. Um, but I mean, I do think it may make up because I think you asked also about the sort of importance of it. I mean, there
Yeah.
are many other ways, and it's probably not been a main focus, at least in the kind of current efforts to legalize, at least
Hmm.
at the kind of forefront. Um, but as the others maybe kind of reach their terminus and hopefully are adopted. So, for instance, like with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as we see the rights-based
Hmm.
ability to, for religious purposes, have access to psychedelics, or for people who are unhealthy in some way, having access to psychedelics as a treatment for them.
Right.
Um, you know, many of these things maybe should be uh, handled first, and maybe the legal rights for religious use
Hmm.
and for
Hmm.
uh, use in treatment and as therapies are perhaps should be given greater weight than people who want to just enhance themselves. But once we get beyond those, what about the kind of healthy individuals that just want to use psychedelics for fun or to change their consciousness, or things that
Right.
maybe aren't given as much weight by society? And so there's still perhaps at the end of these other kind of
Hmm.
changes, a space for relying on this type of kind of legal argument to still
Right.
find a way to make sure that everybody has access to.
Right. I mean, it's just another way to tune in. Another way,
Mhm.
instead of tuning into the TV all night. Why not have a mind altering or a non-ordinary state of consciousness that you can go ahead and relate to in a more creative way? And that's kind of what you're saying, that people should have a right to that as well. You know?
Yeah, I mean, and if we think about, and this is maybe somewhat unjust, but if we think about cognitive liberty as being a freedom from interference
Hmm.
in our thought and freedom of thought, maybe we should be prohibiting people from using things like certain types of social media or certain TV, because that does
Hmm.
interfere with our ability to have independent thought sometimes.
Right, right.
Um,
And I love the idea of having independent thought when we're well programmed to think otherwise, or to be a part of the system that we didn't necessarily invent in our, we, I don't know whether or not, we can get into we, we can jump down the rabbit hole in this one. Let me ask you, in terms of the convention, you've got these two sessions. Can you talk about those sessions? One's on the 20th, the other one's on the 23rd. What are they all about? Because I know you're involved with the Psychedelic Bar Association, and you're also a member of the Shakaruna Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. So I'm just wondering, how does this all kind of come together and in those sessions when you're at the convention, and what can we possibly expect from those sessions?
Sure. Well, so I do have two sessions. The first session is part of a workshop put on by the Psychedelic Bar Association, which, as you mentioned, I'm involved with. I was the founding steward of the IP committee, which was still is a group of a couple dozen IP lawyers who are interested in psychedelics and part of the PBA, and I'm now also on the board of the PBA. So I'm very
Hmm.
honored to be able to be involved in that way. And so this is a legal workshop for people who are interested in the different legal aspects of psychedelics. And there's a number
So
of
if,
different
so
sessions.
if you're a lawyer and you want to be, if you've already, you're involved in the space in one way or another, and you wanted to be a member of the Psychedelic Bar Association, you could apply given your background or given your credentials. Is that kind of the
Yeah,
way that
yeah,
works?
absolutely. So we're mostly lawyers. There are some non-lawyers, some patent agents actually also, who are part. And the PBA will have a booth during the convention. So I certainly would invite anybody who's a lawyer or has any involvement in the legal world to stop by and to talk to us, and certainly to join if interested. So this panel I'm putting on with a colleague of mine, Chris Burns, who's also a patent attorney. Another attorney, Rebecca Lee Whiting, who is the general counsel of Journey Collab, a company that's been developing synthetic mescaline for alcohol use disorder. And she also has a law firm where she does work with startups in the psychedelic space and in other areas. And Joseph Barsuglia, who's done a lot of research with 5-MeO-DMT and ibogaine, and has been someone who's really stood up for the rights of ibogaine in particular, and has a lot of really, I think, meaningful things to say about the Nagoya Protocol and the type of means for bringing psychedelics ethically to people. And so our panel actually is about ways of using ethical IP. And so we'll be discussing what some of the kind of the downsides of how IP has been used, and trying to think of ways we can change our our interaction with the IP system, and even with patents, so as to avoid some of the ways that they can be problematic for the psychedelic space, and hopefully do that in a way that's potentially not just inspiring for the psychedelic space, where the ethos is a little bit different than it is sort of in the broader world at large generally, but think of ways even to potentially reimagine the patent system more broadly. So that's
on the 20th. That's on the 20th.
Right? Okay, yeah, great. And as part of a half-day workshop put on by the PBA, and then the conversation on Friday is also about patents, of course. I'm speaking along with Retsina Meyer, who's the head of corporate strategy for Calyx Therapeutics. Calyx has focused on non-psychedelic psychedelics. It's started by David Olson, who was at Davis, who coined the term psychoplastogens. And so it'll be interesting. And many things we talked about today, I don't think we necessarily got into how psychedelics have taken a turn, at least with patents. I kind of forgot to mention some of the novel compounds have been without psychedelic effects. And so, what does it mean to have drugs that are inspired by psychedelics but don't actually cause any subjective experience? And and so just so we can unpack that for a moment. So psychedelic, non-psychedelics are without the journey or without the hallucinatory impact of what a psychedelic would be, but with the opportunity to quiet the default mode network, the part of the brain that really is the meaning-making side of the brain, to really, or the amygdala, and really help you to confront or deal with in a psychotherapeutic way, or in a biological way, a physiological way, to come to terms with some issues. Did I describe that right? Or I think that might be the case. I mean, so nobody has been able to demonstrate that yet, just because the psychoplastogens have not yet been trialed in humans. So there's evidence that they cause neuroplasticity. So we can see dendrite growth, for instance, in nerve cells, but they haven't been administered to humans, where the humans have been put in fMRI machines to show this sort of quieting of the default mode network that we've seen in trials with psilocybin and LSD. But maybe that's ahead for them. Certainly, once they're administered to humans. So that's where the patents come in, and that's where the trials and the research comes in, huh? Yeah, there's still a lot of research to be done with non-psychedelic psychedelics. And so besides Calyx, we'll also be joined by CC Lee, who's at Porta Sophia as the senior data architect lead. And Porta Sophia has played an important role in the psychedelic space. There's been a lot of criticism around psychedelic patents being granted on things that were already in the public domain. And one explanation for that is because patent examiners either aren't familiar with the prior art, as it's called, just whatever's known and has been published around psychedelics. They missed it, so they didn't realize something was already done, was not novel or not obvious, or just that sort of prior art isn't anywhere that would be available to a patent examiner. It's buried in archives, or it's oral traditions, or it's just harder to find, or it's on websites like Arrowhead or Blue Light or someplace that are a patent examiner is not going to go to. So Porta Sophia has tried to make all that information more accessible to patent examiners to make it easier for good patents to be
great
granted.
Name there, Sophia. Yeah, love
Porta
that.
Sophia, yeah, doorway to wisdom, I would imagine. And then Jonathan Sporn, the CEO, and he's also board chairman at Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals, so another of the psychedelic drug discovery and development companies, who's also working with a number of different drugs that are based on the same sorts of scaffolds as psychedelics, tryptamines and ibogaine-like compounds and phenethylamines. And so I think in that panel, we'll discuss the perspectives of what people think about patents as drug discovery companies, and what it means for them to be patenting things. And then with Cece, I think be able to really discuss what it means to have bad patents in the space, or what kind of conflicts.
Interesting. So, like we go from that end to, and I mentioned Chakaruna earlier. So, and then you're on the council of the Chakaruna Protection of Sacred Plant Council. So, how does your work with that organization? I know you're a pluralist, so we've got that straight. So, how does that tie into where we see the goals for the psychedelic industry overall? I mean, where do you see the intersection of those two, organizations, if you will? On the one hand, the pharmaceutical company that's looking to patent, looking to go ahead from a biotech viewpoint, looking to go ahead and take it to market. And on the other hand, an organization that really is looking to protect the sacred plants and the sacred wisdom that's there, and in some cases doesn't want to hear about what's happening in the pharmaceutical area, or certainly wants to apply this indigenous wisdom in some way towards that marketplace. I'm wondering your thoughts around that, and this is it's a good segue towards bringing us towards our goal here, which is going to the convention, right? So tell me your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think our goal for the convention, my goal for the convention, but I think maybe it's all of our goal for the convention, is to be in a space where I think there may even be more than 10,000 tickets sold ultimately. I know that was at least a goal of MAPS. Yep. And of all of those people, there will be people representing every type of interest in the space and hope for the space and way of being in the space and knowledge about the space. And so there'll be so many different types of people to learn from and hopefully to have conversations with. And that, in a smaller sense, is the reason why I feel really fortunate to be able to be part of Chakuna's Council for Protection of Sacred Plants, because in my work, as I've said a couple of times, it's really focused on drug discovery and companies that are venture backed and want to have their compounds go through the clinical trial process and become approved drugs. And that's very different from the type of work that Chakuna is trying to protect, the traditional and indigenous uses of particularly ayahuasca, but other compounds and other medicines. And so I think it feels critical to me to be able to hear from both sides and to find ways to sometimes resolve tensions or try to resolve tensions. I mean, that's part of the spirit that animates the ethical IP conversation. And as part of Chakuna, we had a whole series on patenting the sacred, about what it meant to be filing patents on natural compounds or compounds that had histories of traditional use.
Really? Well, Chakuna did that, huh? Wow.
And so
we're going to be able to patent the sacred? I mean,
well, I mean, there's the question, like, does even patenting something kind of take the sacred out of it. I mean,
Right.
so um,
Once you
there,
define
there's
something, you lose the definition of it, really. So,
yeah,
some way.
yeah, but hopefully in patenting at least some aspects of psychedelics, we're not taking the sacred away from uh, psychedelics in general. And so, this
Right.
is, I guess, uh, just staying with the
Mhm.
pluralistic aspect of it, or at least the optimistic part of the optimistic pluralist aspect of it. I mean, I hope we do keep the sacred, and even if maybe we don't find the sacred, although certainly people people do, even when they're having it in a medical context. I mean, the mystical experience is not one that hides from anybody at a high enough dose of
Mhm.
psychedelics.
Well,
But
I think you're straddling. It's exciting to listen to you, Graham, and to hear the work you're doing, because you really are straddling both sides of this conversation, and whether or not it's from the sacred viewpoint or the biotech viewpoint, or whether or not it's from everything in between, which really speaks to the cognitive liberty that we've talked about in this psychedelic space, which is give me the opportunity to make my own choices. How I want to make the choice might be different for me than for you, but still respect that and give me the opportunity and the liberty to do that. So, when we start taking a look at this event, the convention is going to be very exciting. Everyone's coming together. You're
mhm,
going to be there. You're going to have your event on the 20th and the 23rd, and you've got your practice. How do people get a hold of you to find out a little bit more about what you're up to if they can't make the convention, or they want to find out about your practice and in general? Maybe they have some ideas, or maybe they have a patentable product that they're looking for help with.
mhm. Well, I'm on Twitter, though I've
Mhm.
been there less lately. But I'm Calyx Law on Twitter. I'm pretty much Calyx Law everywhere, and our firm is Calyx Law, so I'm
Mhm.
fairly easy to find. And I'm
Right.
Graham at calyx.law. I'm happy to
Mhm.
receive emails there. I would definitely recommend people look up Chacuna if they haven't heard of them.
Mhm.
Besides the Patenting the Sacred series, there's really a enormous wealth of other webinars and materials, and
Right.
much of what we talked about today, just in passing, has some deeper resource there. Certainly for anybody who's involved in the legal system as a lawyer or as a paralegal, or in any other way, should check out the Psychedelic Bar Association. Um, and
Mhm.
I'm also editor at large at Psychedelic Alpha, where I post patent trackers, and we also host a policy map along with a merge law group that has the current status of legalization and decriminalization efforts across all the states in the U.S. and soon to be posted around the world. And
Mhm.
so, that's a good resource and has a really good weekly newsletter.
Mhm.
Um, and so those would probably be the best places to keep in touch, I think.
Excellent, excellent. Well, you're really very you're very, I don't know, you've got a real kind of peaceful vibe about you. I don't
Hmm.
know, it's and I certainly would love to work with you in some respect if I had a patent that was ready to go to market. I don't yet. But who knows what'll happen with that. I want to thank you, Graham, for being with us today. I really look forward to hearing more about your insights and experiences as we explore the world of psychedelic laws and your mindful approach to them as well. I look forward to seeing you when somewhere among the 10,000 people that'll be there. It's going to be a sacred experience in and of itself.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, thank you for asking me to join you here. And hopefully, what seems like my calm is not just my being tired at the end of a Friday, but no, I'm really pleased to be able to join you here. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you hopefully in Denver.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fiveson.